Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly podcast, Casual Fridays. I also upload a technique video on every Tuesday called Technique Tuesday, and in each video, I will always leave direct links down in the description so that you can jump from one point in the video to another if you'd like to skip something or go back and review it again. So in this week's podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about Finish It February, which is coming up next week. I want to share with you a couple of works in progress, and I want to get your opinion on where I should go forward with one of those projects. Then I want to update you on my upcoming 1920s vintage sweater project. And then I want to end with a discussion about gauge that came from the Rocks group. In fact, I'll be talking about gauge a lot throughout this particular episode. So if that's something of interest to you, you're in luck. So let's get started. Finish It February starts next week. I have a thread in my Ravelry group, which I'm going to link down below for people who want to participate in Finish It February. The point of Finish It February is to pull out all of your UFOs, your unfinished objects, and then make a decision about the future of those objects. Have they been kind of languishing in your pile of UFOs for 20 years or 30 years? That can happen. Do you really want to keep it there? Or would you be happier if you finished it or threw it away or just ripped it out, returned the yarn to your stash? It's just an opportunity to make decisions about things. And sometimes it's a very easy decision. You're like, I will never enjoy knitting this or completing this. I don't want to use it. I hate this. This is an awful yarn. And you just throw it away. Other times you have mixed feelings about things. Maybe you like the project, but you really didn't enjoy working on it. And you might want to come up with some sort of a plan for how you can work on it a little bit at a time over the next few months so that it will get done without feeling like a burden on you, like, oh, this is all I'm working on right now. I hate this. So you just kind of work out some time management problems that you might have with getting these things done. And then sometimes you find things that you totally forgot about and you really like and you're absolutely happy to finish it. It had slipped your mind that you even had it. So those are the kinds of things that you might want to do with Finish It February. If you don't finish everything in February, that's fine. You've made a big dent in it. And maybe then next year you will make a bigger dent in it. So I have found in the past few years that I gradually have fewer and fewer things in my UFO pile, which I'm happy about. And some of that has to do with not continuing to drag along the really old UFOs, just finally saying, okay, it's been 20 years, what's it going to be? And making a decision and then just being happy with it. For me this year, rather than having to finish a lot of unfinished projects, because I don't have that this year, I am addressing my yarn storage. It's been a few years since I went through and organized it, and I really kind of like the system that I set up. Well, I like it a lot. It has worked really well for me, but I just end up every few years running out of room to put new yarn. And that became very apparent to me as I started opening up all of these bins in various places where I knew I had shoved projects. So, I was actually looking for projects and I would open these bins and I would see all of this yarn that I had forgotten I had bought. And I hadn't put it away in the normal place where I can see it. That's why I keep it on display so I can see it and know that I have it. And I didn't have room for it there, so I shoved it in bins and then forgot about it. And that's the problem with putting things in bins. So what I'm trying to do is reorganize things so that bins are devoted to leftovers. And I have a certain bin for my sock yarn leftovers. I've had that for a number of years. I don't use my sock yarn leftovers very often, but sometimes I'll have a friend who's working on one of those modular projects that uses little bits of scrap yarn and little bits of sock yarn, and I just say, here, help yourself. Sometimes there's enough to make a baby hat for a newborn baby. So I have all my sock yarn in one bin, and what I've done this year is I've taken all my worsted weight leftovers, because I really do use worsted weight more than anything else. I've taken them all out of my main storage and put them in a separate bin. Anything that's less than a skein I have taken out of there, because I have, what I need that for is really full skeins, sweaters worth of yarn, that kind of thing that I can actually see and know that there's enough for a project. And the leftovers are for if I want to do a color work, if I want to swatch something for an idea to see if it's going to work, and then I can use that. So my bins are being shifted over to being where all the leftovers go, and they each yarn weight has its own bin for that. So I think that is going to help me at least for the next year or two, and then I'll have to go through it all and reorganize again. So a quick update on the sweater I'm knitting for my daughter. I got the body done, and I've got one sleeve done. I decided I had a couple of more decreases, and then I was going to work, I don't know, 4 inches of ribbing. I thought she might like a nice long cuff. And so I decided to try it on, and my first thought was, oh, it's too small. And then I realized it's not for me, it's for my 22-year-old daughter. And I also felt like, oh, it's too short, but I know she wants it short. And yet I look on this model and I think, you know, but I think this dress form is probably shorter than she is. When she was home for Thanksgiving, I wanted to get a sense of how long she wanted it. And what I did was I had her put a sweater on that was the length that she wanted. And then I was trying to measure both from the front and the back to see how long it was. And they were different measurements. And I think it's because, you know, she's got a bust here. And so I think that the sweater was just stretching over there, but it was still maintaining its full length. And I don't know if it's the right length, if it's too short, or if it's too long. I think it's potentially the correct length, but I really don't know. It's way too short for me. And I tried the sleeve on, and I actually thought the sleeve was the correct length, and I could probably start the cuff now rather than continuing it and then doing the cuff. I wrote all of these things down when I measured her, and I have no idea what I wrote it on, if it was on a piece of paper, if it was in a notebook, so that I wouldn't lose it. I have no idea. So I should have just put it right in my Ravelry project, but I didn't. So I was saying to her, I wish she were here so that I could try this on her and I would know if it was the right length, and I didn't know what length the sleeve that should be. And so she sent me a picture and said, this is how I like it. Thank you. So some of this is just guesswork, but at least if it's top down, if I have to, I can rip it back. The problem is if I put the button bands on and it's too long and I have to rip out the button band and then rip out the bottom and reknit this and reknit the button band, that is not going to be happy times. You know, this is it's so boring at this point. It's all stockinette. It's not very interesting. I'd really like to get this done, and I'm hoping that it's going to fit her. We'll see. The next project I'm working on is a mitten, a pair of mittens that is for the International Wolf Center. They are located, it's a private nonprofit that is located up north in Ely, Minnesota, near the Boundary Waters, right near Canada. And they have wolves at the center, and it's an educational center. So people can learn about wolves. And every year they have an online silent auction to raise funds for the center. And one of the things that they've been doing for the past couple of years is working with some of the hand spinners at the Weavers Guild to create yarn that contains wolf fur. And the way they get this wolf fur is because the wolves that live at the center, every spring they kind of blow their winter coats the way dogs do, and they are hand brushed in order to get that undercoat off. And I had to get government approval then for it to be used to turn into this yarn. So it gets sent down here, and there's some spinners who spin it together with other fibers or other yarns. And then those yarns are knit or woven or crocheted into items that are then put in the silent auction and bid on to support the Wolf Center. So I signed up this year to make a pair of mittens. The idea was that you provisionally cast on at the wrist, you knit the mittens, an adult size mitten, small, medium, or large, and then on February 1st or 2nd, first, I think, February 1st, everybody who volunteered will go to the textile center and they'll get a certain amount of this wool fur it's been spun with like a novelty yarn, and they can use that to knit the cuffs of the sweater. So they had one get together earlier this year, and some friends of mine in my knitting group had made mittens for that, and when they got to the event, they realized that the yarn that has the wool fur is pretty chunky yarn, and they had knit to finer gauges, and they really struggled to try to figure out a way to blend the knitting of the wool fur in with the mitten. So knowing that, I changed my initial idea for a mitten. Initially, I thought, oh, I could do something with a light colored worsted weight wool that has like a texture pattern that maybe has a face of a wolf or something, and I was working on a design for that and thinking how I was going to do that. Then I found out, well, oh no, the yarn is going to be a lot thicker. So then I had to rethink what I was going to do, and I decided to knit something that was a lot chunkier. And this is where the first gauge lesson comes in. As I was going through my stash and trying to reorganize it as part of my Finish It February, I pulled this yarn. I had these 2 balls of dark purple yarn that I've had for at least 10 years. I bought it on impulse. This is why I don't stash yarn, because it takes me forever to figure out what to do with it, if I ever do. And it was an Aran weight yarn, and it was from New Zealand. And it contains about 50% merino and 10% nylon, and the other 40% is possum fur. So this was a booth at our local sheep and wool festival that was selling exotic fibers. And I lived in New Zealand for a year, so I knew immediately when I saw possum fur, I knew exactly what the circumstances were around the possum fur and how it became part of this yarn. So when I lived in New Zealand, this was back in the late 80s, I shared a house with these 2 firemen. And the way that their work shifts were is like 4 days on, 4 days off. And so a lot of firemen had a trade, and one of my flatmates or housemates was a plumber. So he would often do plumbing work on his 4 days off. And the other housemate had been a professional hunter for the New Zealand Forestry Department. And his job was to go out in the bush and hunt deer, and he would cut the tails off and bring them back to show the Forestry Department how many he had shot, because I think the exception is one, maybe there's more than one, but there's like a species of bat in New Zealand that is a mammal, the only native mammal in New Zealand. And otherwise, any mammals that are in New Zealand were introduced, and often when they were introduced, they become an invasive species because they have no natural predators. So the deer were destroying the bush, and so they needed people to hunt them, and possums were the same. And so I knew that that the fiber that was in this yarn that I got that had possum fur in it was because of the same issue of it being an invasive species in New Zealand. So I bought this. I thought, that's really interesting. I don't know if I'll ever see that again, which is why I impulsively bought it. And it's been sitting there for 10 years. So it's an Aran weight yarn, and I knew that for these mittens that I needed something thicker that would be more compatible with whatever the yarn I get that has the wool fur in it. So I decided to use 2 strands of the yarn together, and there's a trick for predicting what your gauge is going to be when you are combining 2 strands of yarn together. So if you are combining 2 yarns of different weights, or even if they're the same weight, even if they're the same exact yarn, you add the 2 gauges together, and then you divide by 3. And that's going to tell you the approximate gauge for this new thicker yarn. So I was using this Aran weight yarn. The gauge is 4.5 stitches per inch. So I add 4.5 and 4.5 together, because that's each strand. That's 9 stitches per inch. And I divide that by 3. So it's 3 stitches per inch. So I could get a yarn that produces 3 stitches per inch. So then the next thing is to figure out, well, what needle do I need to get 3 stitches per inch? So for many gauges, I automatically know what needle size I need to get things. But some of these thicker gauges I don't work at very often, and I don't always just know right off the bat. So I do know that for a regular bulky weight yarn at 3.5 stitches per inch, I need a US 10.5, which is 6.5 millimeters. So I know 3.5, I need a 10.5. So I needed 3 stitches per inch. So I thought, okay, I don't want to go up. In the US sizes, you go from 10.5 to 11. And so that's 6.5 millimeter to 8 millimeter. That's a huge jump. But there are some metric needle sizes in between. There's a 7 millimeter and a 7.5. Sometimes the 7 millimeter is referred to as a 10 3/4, and the 7.5 millimeter is referred to as a 10 7/8 needle. Regardless, I tried the 7 millimeter needle. I was able to get 3 stitches per inch, and I decided whether or not I actually liked that fiber, because that's the next step when you're combining 2 strands of yarn is, what is the approximate gauge? If I get that gauge, do I like it or not? So I did like that. And so I made a mitten to fit my hands. I traced my hand because I'm a medium-sized adult, so I traced my hand. And then I did the calculations I needed to figure out how to make a mitten this size. Well, I still wanted to put something on the back of the mitten. I couldn't fit a wolf head. Like a picture, because I only had, this mitten is only 24 stitches around, so I only have 12 stitches on the back of the hand. So I was thinking about that Magic Motifs book that I talked about a few weeks ago, where it was with stranded colorwork. You could do secret messages. Well, it has other kinds of coding systems that you could use to create messages in that book. And one of them, one of the ideas was using Braille. So I looked up the letters for the WOLF, and then I charted them out and decided, which I'll show you how I charted it. I'll put it up there. And it's really hard to see. All you can see really, if you look at, and this is so dark, all you can see are there's kind of these just bumps on there. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to actually keep those there, if I should rip back and reknit it. I took it to knitting group the other day, and my friend who is doing the same project said, no, I think you should keep it in there. She did it with the Magic Motif colorwork with her first set of mittens. She did wolves, I think was the word that she knit in, and she wrote it on a card. So that it would be part of the online auction, that people would know that was the secret message in there. And she's like, no, I think you should keep that in there. I think that actually will add to, the value of it. So the next question is, how am I going to work the cuff? Because I don't really know how thick this yarn is going to be. I just kind of have an idea. It's probably in the super bulky range. It may be similar thickness to the yarn, to what I ended up with this. It might be even thicker. So I have a couple of ideas, but I'm all ears for suggestions. Apparently there's a really limited amount. You get a certain amount, you have to use half for each. So it wouldn't be enough to knit a cuff this long, for example. So I might want to try to use it in combination with this purple yarn in some way. So one idea would be just to go ahead and knit a ribbed cuff and then add something at the end that would flip over, flip back, or that would be like an open, like if I did like a garter stitch cuff that flipped over but was split at the side, so that could just act like a cool cuff. I thought of doing a Latvian braid, but if the yarns aren't quite compatible with the thicknesses, if the wolf yarn overpowers this yarn, that won't work very well. So I've been trying to come up with a couple of different ideas, knowing that the amount of yarn I have is going to be limited, not knowing exactly how much it is I will have or how thick it will be. So if any of you have ideas, I'm all ears, and I'd love to hear your suggestions. All right, so I want to update you on my vintage sweater project. The yarn I ordered it a couple of weeks ago, and it finally came on Wednesday. And so the colors, I'm using basically the same colors that the original pattern called for, because that was part of what really attracted me with those bright colors. So I'm using, for my vintage sweater, I'm using Barocco vintage worsted weight yarn. So Barocco is a mix of acrylic and superwash wool, so it's machine washable. And I chose that because I knew I would be wearing this more as a blouse, like right next to my skin. So I needed to make something or use something that would be comfortable. And I don't tend to like working with 100% superwash wool. I will, but I just don't like the way it feels. I don't like the way it behaves when I wash it. And the acrylic wool blends tend to behave more like wool, in my experience, than a superwash wool behaves. So that's why I chose that, and it comes in just a bunch of colors. So this is the main color, the main background color. It's kind of a beigey color. It's not really completely like a natural color like the sweater I'm making for my my daughter. So it's kind of this sandy color. And then there's black. There's a blue. And there is a yellow color, this kind of a goldy yellow. And then there's this kind of heathered red color. This ended up at first I was a little disappointed by this color, and you probably aren't seeing this colors the way they really are in real life. It's a little bit heathery. It's a really pretty red. I was kind of imagining in my head a brighter red, but I actually like these better, because I feel like if it was a little brighter red, it might have felt too much like I was a kindergarten teacher with a box of primary color Crayolas or something. For the yarns, they came in hanks, and I wound up one of each color into a yarn cake. And this has come up a couple of times this week, this particular question about yarn cakes and being able to work with the yarn from the center without it twisting too much. And I did a video on this about 1.5 years ago, where I go through and explain exactly what's happening and why twist enters into it or not. And it can get a little confusing if you're just trying to figure out how do you wind the yarn ball so that you can work from the center without it twisting. So this is what I do. I wind from the swift to the ball winder. That is spooling the yarn. That is just, it's like if you had a spool of ribbon and you were spooling off one onto the other. It's just, or like a old reel-to-reel tape recorder. It's just spooling from one to the other when you do that the first time. For me, I usually find that ball is a little tight. And so I want to wind it a second time so that it's a little softer like this, so that there's no tension on the yarn when I'm going to knit from it. So I put the ball next to me, like if the swift was to my left, and when I take the ball off, I put the ball to my left, pull the center out, put it back on the ball winder, and wind it again in the same direction I wound it the first time. This is going to end up adding some twist to the yarn because you're pulling it out of the center like this. You're not spooling it off this way. And that is going to add some twist to the yarn. When you take it off and you pull it out to start working with it, you're going to add more twist. So what I do when I wind it the second time, and I'm taking it off the ball winder, I push that center strand through to the other side. That way, as it's coming off of the ball, it is unwinding in the opposite direction. So it's taking the twist out that you added when you were winding it. Now, there's a reason why you might be adding twist or eliminating twist, and it has to do with the twist of the yarn to begin with, and it has to do with the direction in which it's being wound on the ball winder. So it could be that the way that you were winding it actually removed some twist, but again, pushing it through to the other side will add any twist that you removed. So you negate the twist that you add or remove in the second ball winding by pushing it through. If you only wind the yarn once, you're not adding any twist. But if you knit by pulling from the center, you are going to be adding some twist. So some people, what they do, will wind off of the swift onto the ball winder, doesn't add any twist, and then they'll put the ball on like a spike, and then they will knit from the outside by having the ball spool off that way, and that won't add any additional twist either. That is not how I prefer to knit. Some people love that. That's their preference. They'll have, and that is fine. I really like knitting from the center pull, and I like to be able to throw it in my ball, in my project bag and take it with me. I don't want to take a spike with me. I don't want to spool off. So there's nothing right or wrong about either way. It's just an option. And I'll link to that video that I was talking about that explains it and demonstrates it with ribbon and shows you what's going on and why it works, if you are interested in seeing that. So in between working on the boring sleeve of my daughter's sweater and waiting for the yarn to arrive, I started doing some swatching for crochet. One of the things that made me reluctant about taking on this 1920s sweater is that there were some critical components of the sweater that are done in crochet. And my crochet skills are pretty rudimentary. I decided, I think it was when I came back to knitting in 2005, and over the next couple of years, there were a couple of projects that I was knitting that called for adding some crochet embellishments. And so I worked at trying to understand those instructions that were given, and I was able to sort of muddle through those projects. But I decided that I felt like I should really know more about crochet, even though I may not want to I keep saying wanting to say knit crochet projects, even though I don't want to work entire crochet projects. I just feel like I should know enough about it to know when it might be useful in certain situations, and just to be able to use it if a pattern calls for it, and keep my mind open to, oh, that project calls for both knitting and crochet, and I feel competent enough to use both of them. So I think I looked on Amazon because I knew I'd bought this book years ago and I didn't know when. It was in 2008. I bought this book called Crocheting for Dummies. I had been looking online for online tutorials. I've been looking for videos on YouTube. YouTube was pretty young still, and even though there were a number of knitting tutorials on YouTube, there were a few crochet, but I just couldn't get the specific information that I wanted from those introductory lessons. And so I searched and searched and searched, and then I think I found a page or something from this book online, and it had exactly the information I wanted. So I bought the book. It's Crocheting for Dummies. I think this was the first edition, which was published in 2004. I bought it in 2008. And I looked, and now they're up to the third edition, and they have videos that go along with it too. So, which I have not looked at. I don't know if you have to buy that book to see the videos or not. But I really, every time I come back to crocheting because I want to learn something new, or I want to refresh my memory, this book has very clear illustrations. They demonstrate things whether you are working left or right-handed, so whichever direction you're crocheting. It's really, really good. And if I have a specific question I want to look up, I can find that in here. So every time I come back to crochet, I have a little bit more muscle memory, and I see that my skills have actually improved because, I had that issue of being too tight at first and then not being able to count stitches and, all that kind of stuff. So I wanted my crochet to be good enough for this project because the cuffs of the sleeve wasn't such a big deal for me that if it wasn't super great, but the collar of the sweater has all those little squares are made up of crochet, and that is where the eye is going to be drawn. So I really wanted to do a decent job on that. So I've been practicing. Well, the problem with the instructions in the vintage pattern are as sparse as they are for the knitting aspects, they're even sparser for the crochet. And trying to figure out it does the same thing as with the knitting, where it says specifically how many stitches they want you to have, and then how many rows in each color they want you to work. They don't tell you what size that is. They don't tell you anything about a gauge. So you have no idea what this finished thing is supposed to be. And so you can't tell if you are getting the right gauge. And you're like, oh, swatch to get the fabric you want. Fine, but that if I have to work 12 stitches for 48 rows, that may end up giving me something that I don't want. And if I knew what the size was supposed to be, then I could use a combination of a gauge that I liked with the number of stitches and rows to give me the thing that I want. And so it's been very frustrating. I've been trying to look up certain information about crochet, assuming based on my knowledge in knitting that there were certain standards in crochet in terms of, you know, if they happen to give you any gauge information on a yarn ball band for crochet, which often they do not. The stitch to row gauge ratio varies wildly from one yarn to another. Like there's no consistency in that ratio. Like with knitting, you know, it's like a 2 to 3, it's somewhere between 2 to 3 and 3 to 4. There's this ratio of stitch to row gauge that gives you this rectangular shape. And that holds true regardless of how thick the yarn is. But with crochet, I'm not finding that. And I'm not finding that I'm not finding that, and I'm not able to look it up anywhere. And I finally was able to hear from one person in the vintage knitting group that single crochet is square, she said. I'm like, okay, well that tells me 12 stitches and 48 rows means that they want the cuff to be 4 times as long as it is wide. And then I can kind of sort of guess then what the likely gauge is supposed to be. And I know that I need 12 of these squares that are 12 stitches wide that have a 2 round border around it, that there will be 12 of these surrounding the neckline. And so I can kind of guess what size those are supposed to be. And what was kind of puzzling to me was that the gauge must be very, very tight for the crochet. And so I heard from another person that with vintage, those old 100 years ago, they worked the crochet to a much firmer gauge than people tend to do today. So that was another hard aspect, is that even if I could find contemporary information, it wasn't necessarily going to give me exactly what I needed to know about gauges for the vintage stuff. So I think that the crochet gauge is either supposed to match the stockinette gauge, 5 stitches per inch, or to be even firmer. And I was really struggling to try to get the information that I wanted, like to try to figure out like what these ratios are so I could try to solve this puzzle. And somebody posted an answer this afternoon. She said, you're looking at this problem in the wrong way in order to get the answers you need. You know, the way you're trying to solve this problem is not going to give you the answer that you're looking for. And what she said was that she has knit many vintage garments simply from a photograph. Like she didn't even have a pattern, just looking at a photograph. And what she did, she would measure those things. So she would see, you know, how many millimeters long the body was, and then how many millimeters long is the collar. And so that gave her some clue about the proportions within the garment itself. And I thought, oh, that's a great tip, because then I can measure those little squares of the collar and compare those, say, to the length of the sweater, and get a sense of what those proportions likely should have been. Because I really need to solve this problem before I get to the underarm, because the width of that cuff will determine how long I need to make the sleeve. And that information is going to feed into how big those squares are. I mean, I could use different proportions for the collar than I used for the cuff, but I'd like to just understand what was actually going on. And that showed me how when you know very little about a topic, that you can make these assumptions about what your problem is, and then and then asking for a solution to that problem, when really you have a different problem and there's a different solution for it. So I knew I didn't know very much, but I really did think that I was trying to solve this problem in the correct way based on my knitting knowledge. What I'm hearing from people is there's no standards for crochet, and that part of that is that everybody's row gauge can vary so much. I'm like, really? Like, how, and how much could it vary? I mean, compared to like knitters don't always match row gauge. That I know that, but it just seems so unbelievable to me. But then I don't know anything about crochet. So I'm going to have to trust the people that are saying this, but I want to know why. So that is going to be my next thing that I'm going to try to solve, is trying to understand crochet and why it's so difficult to have these standards. And it's just confounding to me. I do think that whatever the assumed gauge for this crochet is supposed to be, it might simply be impossible for me to get that with the yarn I'm using. All I know about the yarn that was originally called for is the gauge it was worked at. I don't really know the qualities of that yarn and how it's constructed. And it's possible that you can really compact that yarn into a very firm, more stitches per inch because of its qualities than I would be able to do with the yarn that I actually am using. So that's one of the challenges too, is that, I have to make assumptions about the yarn and what would be a suitable substitute without really knowing much at all of anything about the yarn that was originally called for in the pattern. So the last thing I want to talk about is a question that has come up a couple of times in my Ravelry group recently regarding projects where the knitter dutifully made a gauge swatch and noted that their gauge was not the same as what was called for in the pattern, but misinterpreted what that meant. And this is a really common misconception, and I can remember trying to sort it out in my head when I was first learning about gauge. So here's the issue. Let's say your pattern calls for 18 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And you knit up your gauge swatch and you're getting 16 stitches over the 4 inches or the 10 centimeters. What some people the way some people interpret that is, I have a smaller number of stitches. That means I have a smaller gauge. That means that I'm knitting tighter. And that is not, in fact, what it means. And so sometimes they just think, okay, then whatever I'm knitting is going to end up being smaller, and that might be what I want, or I don't want it to be smaller, so I'm going to knit a larger size using my gauge, and then it will be the right size for me. What helped me was to have a way to visualize what was really going on. And the way I visualize it was thinking about like kids sitting on a bench versus adults sitting on a bench. So if you have a bench and it is a specific width that is going to stay constant, you can get a lot of little kids on that bench because each little kid is small. But if you had football players that you wanted to sit on that bench, you wouldn't be able to get that many of them because they would all be really big. So if you have big people sitting on a bench, you can't have that many of them. But if you have little people sitting on the bench, you can have a lot of them. And they're all sitting on the same bench contained in the same space. So you have fewer people on that bench. That's the same as saying fewer stitches per inch. If you have fewer stitches per inch, that's because they're bigger. And if they're bigger, then they're going to take up more room. Therefore, if you have 100 people that you have to sit in benches, you are going to need fewer benches to seat 100 little kids, and you're going to need more benches if you need to seat 100 football players. So the fewer stitches you have per inch, the bigger those stitches are, and the more space they're going to take up. So if you are doing your gauge swatch and you're getting fewer stitches per inch than what your pattern calls for, and you use the same number of stitches that the pattern calls for, your item is going to be bigger. So if you find this to be a tricky thing to try to understand in your head, for me it helped to find some kind of visualization trick, and the little kids and big football players was the thing that worked for me to realize, oh, a bigger stitch means a bigger needle, means it takes up more room. Instead of looking at it and thinking, oh, smaller number means smaller stitches, it's the exact opposite. But keeping that straight in your head sometimes really requires some kind of a visualization trick. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.